Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the second episode of Another American History podcast, or AAHP for short. Last time, we discussed the beginning of Columbus's journey, from his origins along the coast of Italy, to his all-consuming obsession with his voyage west, and finally to the Catholic monarchs of Spain giving him the approval and supplies he needed, if for no other reason than to keep him from taking his ideas elsewhere. This week, we will be continuing on that journey west that began in 1492, and follow Columbus and his crew as they face unknown waters and near mutinies, as well as take a closer look at some of Columbus's crew and how their contributions led to a successful voyage, in many ways more than Columbus. My name is Isaiah, and I'm glad to be back with you sharing this story. Thank you for listening, and let's dive into the history. When we left off, Columbus had just received permission to undertake his long sought-after journey from the monarchs of a newly unified Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand. After signing the capitulations of Santa Fe, which guaranteed Columbus an incredible amount of wealth and power should he successfully return from his journey, it was time for him to begin the actual planning of his voyage. For his long trip, which would end up being much longer than either he or any of his crew expected, he would secure 3 ships, 2 of which would survive to see Spain again. The first would be his flagship, directly under his command and larger than the other 2. The Santa Maria was a carrack, a type of ship which typically has 3 to 4 masts, in this case 3, and was popular at the time in both Spain and Portugal. It weighed a little more than 100 tons and had a singular deck. It was hardly a cruise ship, but was still larger than the other 2 that would be accompanying it. Despite being directly under Columbus's control, it was not owned or even captained by him. These responsibilities fell to Juan de la Cosa, a Castilian navigator and cartographer who, despite his differences with Columbus during this journey, would go on to make 17 total trips to the Americas, and would one day create what is often credited as the first world map that included the Americas as well as Europe and Asia. But not everything would go right for him. He would also eventually die in the New World, being killed by natives while attacking them. The second and third ships were both caravels, smaller ships that used both triangular lateen sails as well as more traditional square ones. These ships were much faster and more agile than Columbus's. The first of these 3 ships was the Santa Clara, nicknamed Niña, meaning little girl, possibly named after her owner, Juan Nino. La Niña has been noted as being Columbus's favorite ship of the 3, and weighed about 60 tons, and was probably about 50 feet in length. This ship was captained by Vicente Pinzon, one of the several Pinzon brothers on the journey who would play a significant role in its success. The ship was small enough that on its first journey, the 26-man crew would have to sleep on its deck due to the lack of room, though after coming across the Native Americans, the sailors would adopt their use of hammocks for more comfortable sleeping arrangements. The third and final ship that would be on the voyage is known simply as Pinta, or Painted One, its real name having been lost to time. This ship was by far the fastest of the 3 and was owned by Cristobal Quintero, although on this journey it would be captained by another Pinzon brother, Martin Alonso, who would perhaps be the most influential of the 3. The Pinzon brothers were not just captains of 2 of the ships on the journey, but instrumental in several ways, most notably Martin Alonso, which we will explore later. Besides Martin Alonso and Vicente Yanez, there was also Francisco Martin, who served as master on the Pinta. They were Spanish sailors, pirates, explorers, and fishermen. For Martin Alonso, the trip was not only to satisfy his sense of exploration, but to make sure he saw a financial return. He was one of the financiers who had sponsored the journey, and wanted to make sure firsthand he was getting his money's worth. Vicente Yanez, on the other hand, would go on to have his own fascination with the New World, not only making several of his own trips to the Americas similar to Juan de la Cosa, but also eventually being accredited with the quote-unquote discovery of Brazil. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus, the Pinzon brothers, Juan de la Cosa, and their crew of about 86 or so were ready to begin their journey. They departed from Palas de la Frontera, Huelva, Spain, sailing down the extremely toxic red-orange Rio Tinto and into the Atlantic Ocean, or the Ocean Sea, whichever you prefer. Only 3 days into the voyage on August 6th, their small squadron of ships were already facing trouble. Unexpectedly, the rudder of the Pinta broke, leaving them unable to steer. The captain of the ship, Martin Alonso, suspected the owner had sabotaged it, being afraid to undertake the journey into the unknown themselves, but this mattered little to him or Columbus. The crew managed to secure the rudder with ropes, which was just enough to hold it in place until they reached their first destination, the Canary Islands. They stopped on Gran Canaria, where they were able to make the necessary repairs to their rudder and continue their journey, probably to the dismay of whichever unfortunate soul had sabotaged it to begin with. It now was stuck along for the journey. From Gran Canaria, they continued to the island of La Gomera, where the Niña had its triangular lanterne sail swapped out with more traditional square ones. On September 6th, with all their final provisions secured and their ships fully repaired, they left the Canary Islands for what would end up being a cramped, unpleasant, and even mutinous 5-week journey across the Atlantic. As we discussed earlier, the ships were small, and oftentimes uncomfortable. Too small for everyone to have their own bed. Men slept on the decks when nowhere else could be found, and were provided little privacy. Imagine, not only being under the direct command and watch of both Columbus and the captain, but having nowhere to even change in private, or even a separate room to use the bathroom. The food wasn't much better than the sleeping conditions. The sailors didn't know exactly how long their journey would be, despite, or perhaps because of, Columbus's best estimates, and after a few weeks would have been relying entirely on preserved foods, such as hardtack or salted meat, which might preserve you nutritionally enough to keep going, but aren't much for taste or enjoyment. On top of this, there was of course the uncertainty of the whole voyage, which had everyone on edge. So on edge that one of the most invested had possibly even sabotaged their own rudder to stop it from happening. Columbus measured his voyage through dead reckoning, a skill which measures the distance of a ship had traveled by plotting its starting point against the known course and estimated speed to calculate a current position, and celestial navigation, or being guided by the constant position of the stars and sun. But without any familiar landmarks to navigate by or confirm their position with, even these methods are subject to becoming only rough estimates over time, a fact which would weigh heavily on the sailors as the days and even weeks passed without any sign of land. On September 13th, Columbus observed what he believed to be his own discovery, but was actually a well-documented phenomenon even at the time. His compass had stopped pointing north. This was an instance of magnetic declination, when a compass needle points towards the Earth's magnetic north, which differs from the so-called true north, which sailors often relied on. Though this is a well-understood occurrence today, neither Columbus nor his crew understood it at the time, and it left him confused and worried, knowing it would not bear well for a journey that was already considered to be into the unknown. To keep his crew calm, Columbus reportedly kept the deviation to himself, making adjustments to the course in private to compensate for the difference. There were, of course, other challenges that Columbus couldn't keep from his crew, namely the weather. Now, you might be expecting me to talk about a massive storm interrupting them, or massive waves toppling a ship, but this couldn't be more of an opposite scenario. Instead, the small convoy faced doldrums, calm periods when neither the wind nor sea were very active. The lack of wind slowed their progress immensely, and the already long journey turned into a crawl. With the cramped living conditions, limited supply of food, an unknown and now changing heading, it's remarkable that the crew went along as they did without any sign of mutiny. But people can only be pushed so far, and eventually their disconnect and uncomfortability rose into treasonous whispers. On October 6th, a month after sailing out of the Canary Islands, the crew's whispers turned into loud statements and verbal concerns, and threatened to continue to get worse. At first, Columbus was hesitant to listen to them, believing he was still on the right track and had made his course adjustments accurately. But the crew disagreed, angrily. As the argument continued and threatened to worsen, in stepped in Martin Pinzon, the previously mentioned captain of the Pinta and one of the famous Pinzon brothers, who quickly noted that he and his crew had spotted a large flock of birds earlier in the day. Being an experienced sailor, Martin knew this often meant land was nearby, and he suggested to Columbus that they alter their course to follow the flock. Whether it was Martin's charisma or fear of his own crew, Columbus agreed and once again changed their heading, which for the time being calmed the men. But it would only be a few days before tensions were rising again. On October 9th, the crew was once again riled up to the point that some of them were demanding to change course or even head back to Spain. Columbus called for a meeting of his captains, and together with the Pinzon brothers and Juan de la Cosa, they came to an agreement that once again placated the crew. If land was not spotted in the next several days, they would return to Spain. This was a critical time for Columbus. We followed along as he's gone from a child leaving his father's business for the sea to a young man abandoning his family in pursuit of funding for his journey, to now being 41 years old and seeing his plan unfurl before him. If they did not discover something within the next few days, it would have all been for nothing. But luck, be it good or bad, would not unfold that way. Instead, on October 11th, they began to spot more signs of land, such as larger flocks of birds and floating seaweed. At around 11 p.m. that night, Columbus and several members of his crew claimed to have spotted a small light in the distance, quote, like a little wax candle rising and falling. While it is not certain exactly what the small light had been, 4 hours later they made a much more important sighting. Rodrigo de Triana, a Spanish sailor aboard the Pinta, called out the other members of the crew around 3 a.m. that he had spotted land. Immediately, Captain Martin Alonso Pizon shot off one of his cannons, a signal to Columbus that their journey was close to an end. Despite this official record, the fact that an entire ship had been aware of it before him, Columbus would later deny Rodrigo the 10,000 maravedis that had been offered as a reward to the first man to spot land, instead insisting he had spotted it long before, claiming the reward for himself. After a few more hours of sailing, the ships had finally landed on an island which Columbus named San Salvador, but which had the indigenous name of Guanahani. While it cannot be officially proven, it is believed that this is the same San Salvador island which exists in the Bahamas today. After weeks at sea, the worn sailors began to make ready to land. Thank you for listening to another American History podcast, or AAHP for short. If you'd like to hear more about Columbus's journey west, his treatment of the natives, and how his actions were perceived back in Europe, please subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. We will be trying to release one episode a month, but as we are a small team and want to make sure we're presenting you with accurate yet entertaining stories and information, we can't make any promises. So the best way to know when a new episode is out is to have your alerts on. If you know any other history nerds or buffs who you would think would enjoy the history of America through stories and revisited myths and legends, please feel free to share. Until next time, thank you for listening to another American History podcast. Produced and edited by Close Tags.